Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can talk about the characteristics of a husband with psychopathic traits. So I did a video not too long ago about the characteristics of a wife with psychopathic traits. So here I'm looking at the husband side. So I answer this question by looking at the 10 signs of a husband with psychopathic traits. I've put together these signs from the research literature and from my experience in terms of consulting and working with people in a clinical setting, like as a counselor. Some of the signs are really quite mild, others more moderate, and some are severe and fairly obvious. Psychopathy has a wide range. It's on a continuum, so somebody can have subclinical psychopathy, so a level of psychopathy where they would not require treatment, and other people can have psychopathy at a level where they may end up with a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, which of course we think of as a disorder that should be treated. Like every mental disorder, it would warrant treatment. Now, just because a husband has one or more of these signs doesn't necessarily mean that they are psychopathic. There could be other explanations for the behavior. So first I'll go through a quick review of psychopathy, then take a look at the signs of the husband's psychopathic traits. So what is psychopathy? So psychopathy is a set of personality traits, and it has two types. And I'm going to use the designation factor 1 and factor 2 when I go through the signs. Factor 1 is primary psychopathy, factor 2 is secondary psychopathy. So it's just easier to say factor 1 or factor 2. So with factor 1, we see characteristics like being manipulative, having fearless dominance, not having remorse, being a pathological liar, and being callous and unemotional. With factor 2, we see characteristics like engaging in criminal behavior, being sensation-seeking, having high neuroticism, having impulsivity, and being irresponsible. Factor 2 psychopathy has an association with antisocial personality disorder, although an extreme level of psychopathy could overlap with that under a variety of circumstances, whether it's factor 1 or factor 2. Now, factor 1 psychopathy is associated with serious crime, but at lower levels it's also associated with success in terms of career, right? So again, psychopathy is on a continuum. Now, factor 2 psychopathy is associated with all levels of crime, not just serious crime, and at the low levels really doesn't impart a lot of benefits. So when we use the term successful psychopathy, we're really talking about low levels of factor 1 psychopathy. We're not really talking about any level of factor 2 psychopathy. Now, as we can see, these two types of psychopathy are really quite different. So as I go through the signs, I'll indicate what type of psychopathy I'm referring to. Also, when I go through these signs, I'm going to use the term husband. And when I use this term, I'm referring to a husband with psychopathic traits. It's just easier to say the word husband than that whole phrase each time. There are a lot of signs to psychopathy, as I mentioned. I'm really focusing here on the signs that would impact the wife or that would be observable to the wife. Although not all of these signs would necessarily be evident from the wife's point of view, most of them would be. So now moving to the signs, let's take a look at sign number 1. This one has to do with emotional regulation. And here we see a large difference between factor 1 and factor 2. With factor 1, we see a husband who's emotionally stable, really too stable. It's essentially an absence of emotion, so being emotionless and cold. The husband cannot be moved to a decision, to make a decision in a way that's favorable for the wife through any type of emotional appeal. So for example, the wife might say, buy this because you love me. That's really not going to do anything in terms of influencing the husband. We also see the husband will be open to compensation or trades, right? So an emotional appeal may not work, but an offer of compensation might work, like money or an offer of intimacy. Now, we see that the husband will not react to someone in pain. This is really an interesting feature of psychopathy. So, for example, if the husband sees that the wife just tripped and fell to the ground, and perhaps that caused some damage, there will be no reaction. The husband won't react. Most people, upon seeing that, would have some sort of reaction. It might look like, oh, I hope you're okay. Just have some sort of physical reaction, facial expressions, all that. We don't see that with psychopathy. Another example here I've seen a few times in my clinical experience would be if the wife has to have some sort of surgery And usually post-surgical, there's some sort of care, like the husband would care for the wife for a few days. With the husband with psychopathic traits, a few hours after getting home, he's already going to be saying something like, "Are you good? I need to go out," or he may want to have sex, even though, again, the wife is not feeling well. So again, really no emotions, and here also a lack of empathy. With factor 2, we see something really quite a bit different. We see high neuroticism. So we see difficulty resisting temptation. This might lead to extramarital affairs. We also see the husband is angry, depressed, anxious. So really you never know how the husband will react. They have unstable emotions. Sign number 2 is superficial charm. This is much more strongly associated with factor 1 than factor 2. We see that when we're looking at superficial charm, we're really talking about a charm that's quite convincing, but it's revealed isn't authentic after close inspection. So this type of charm fools almost everybody, but usually doesn't fool the wife, because the wife knows the husband fairly well. She sees him frequently. We see sometimes when somebody who has extreme psychopathic traits is arrested for a serious crime, the news reporters will interview the neighbors, and they'll say, "He was the nicest guy," because that superficial charm enabled him to fool somebody he doesn't see too often, like the neighbors. But again, the wife would usually know. Moving on to sign number 3, we see this is pathological lying. So more associated with factor 1, but we really see it with both factor 1 and factor 2. Now this lying is not for the purpose of admiration, but rather the husband lies to get something material. With factor 1, we see more careful lying. So the husband tells lies, but he tries to make sure that he can keep them straight, right? So he's careful about the types of lies and the quantity. So with the lies, there'll be a believable and consistent story. For example, if he's staying out late and having an affair, he may have receipts to show what he was doing, people to vouch for him, some believable story. Not just, "Oh, I was out, I was not doing anything." That's what we would tend to hear from the factor 2 psychopath. A more reckless style of lying, lying without really thinking things through. Moving on to number 4, we see here this is related to being fearless and aggressive. And this is really tied in with both factor 1 and factor 2. We see a lot of constructs kind of around these two ideas. For example, the stare of dominance, right? Somebody with psychopathy, the husband with psychopathic traits, has this stare when he looks at people, including the wife, that communicates dominance. The stare really says that anything is possible. He's thinking bad thoughts, like he might be able to get away with an attack. This stare, and really his general demeanor, indicates he's willing to escalate arguments to a frightening level. So again, willing to be aggressive. And not just with the wife, but with other family members, friends, co-workers, strangers. He communicates that he's not going to back down. Again, has no fear. Another interesting thing we see with this sign is that the husband does not think defensively, right? This is tied in with fearlessness and aggression. When looking at a weapon, for example, he never contemplates how it could be used against him, but only how he could use it to harm others. We see the same thing with fire, a fascination with fire and its destructive potential, but again, no regard for how that could hurt him. Also tied in with this sign is this fantasy about dominance, power, and control. That's related again to fearlessness and aggression. And with factor 1, in addition to a stare of dominance, we see a predatory stare. So this is when the husband is thinking about something he can do to a person that will bring him pleasure, but of course will almost always be bad for that other person, including the wife, if that's who he's thinking about or who he's staring at. So the dominant stare, again, is to communicate something, fearlessness. The predatory stare is really a stare that indicates that somebody's lost in a fantasy. Both indicate trouble. Sign number 5 is that the husband has a problem with authority. Like at work, that's where we commonly see it. But as it relates to the wife, if the wife asks the husband to do something, she's going to get resistance. Even if it's a fairly benign request or a fairly normal request, it's taken as an attempt to control the husband. So the husband might say, "You're not the boss of me." So again, we see kind of a fierce independence here with sign number 5. Moving to sign number 6, we see criminality. Of course, this is expected more at the higher range of psychopathy, not necessarily at the lower range. The criminality, the activity of engaging in crimes, can be frequent, It's usually theft or fraud early in life, usually less serious crimes, but over time, the types of crime can really escalate quite a bit, including up to murder. With factor 1, we see the husband thinks before committing the criminal act, so he calculates and weighs the consequences of the crime. Not from a moral point of view, morality is really not important to the husband, but rather trying to avoid a loss of pleasure, right? So really not afraid of consequences, just afraid of losing something that he likes. So there's a difference between considering consequences and being afraid of consequences. So we see here with this husband that there's this idea that he would murder if not for the idea of prison, right? The possibility of going to prison. So again, making calculations before a crime is committed to make sure that he has a good chance of getting away with it. With factor 2, here we see that this husband acts impulsively, but is usually not as dangerous, especially early on in the criminal career. Crimes are not well planned, so the factor 2 psychopath is often caught. We also see with both types of psychopathy, but more with factor 2, that the husband is in and out of prison, right? This is a fairly good indicator of psychopathy. We know that 70% of the male prison population either has antisocial personality disorder, so that's again related to factor 2 psychopathy, or if properly diagnosed, would be found to have antisocial personality disorder. Moving to sign number 7, we see this is sensation seeking. So with factor 2 psychopathy, the husband is going to be easily bored. He's going to push the wife to engage in dangerous activities like substance use. He's going to push for something like risky sexual behavior, or even sometimes behaviors like skydiving or bungee jumping, activities like that. We see when he drives, he tends to speed, tailgate, and just drive recklessly in general. We see that the husband is more attracted to dangerous lines of work, especially ones that involve physical confrontation. Now, another element of this one with the sensation seeking is its association with mortality, meaning dying young. And to understand this, we have to understand the idea of the standardized mortality ratio. So this is the ratio of observed deaths to expected deaths. So for example, in a population of 1,000 people, based on a certain age and gender, we might expect that 10 would have died, right? So the expected mortality would be 10. So if the actual mortality was 20, the standardized mortality ratio would be 2, twice as much as we would expect. So with antisocial personality disorder, again, the one related to factor 2 psychopathy, the SMR is 9. So 9 times higher than we would expect. If an individual with antisocial personality disorder is under age 40, the SMR is 33. 33 times the risk of dying. Much of this risk is tied in with these sensation-seeking behaviors, but not all of the risk is tied in with this. The risk is also associated with some of the other features of psychopathy. Now moving to sign number 8, we see this is a parasitic lifestyle. This applies more to factor 2 psychopathy. Here we see the husband who borrows money from the wife and never repays it. He won't work. He's not looking for work. He has no interest in it. He sits around all day. No long-term goals, no ambition, does not see the value in traditional money-earning strategies, for instance, ones that are legal, or ones that involve like an education and like working your way up through a company. If he gets money, he spends it irresponsibly and quickly. Sign number 9 is fairly straightforward. A husband that threatens to kill his wife, or really anybody else. Threatening to kill people in general is a fairly good indicator of psychopathy. This would be with both factor 1 and factor 2. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about a wife with psychopathic traits that one of the signs was if she hired a contract killer. This is also possible with the husband with psychopathic traits, but usually we see that the husband would involve himself in the killing directly. So the husband would tend to be the killer rather than hiring somebody. And this brings me to sign number 10, which also is tied in with homicide. And this would be if the husband is a serial killer, right? It seems kind of obvious, but it's a good indicator, right? It's one of those things that kind of stands out like, oh, this person's a serial killer. Seems likely they have psychopathy. We see this with factor 1, but also with factor 2. Some serial killers or factor 2 psychopaths. Now, another idea kind of tied in with this particular sign we see sometimes is if a serial killer is married, there's this thought that sometimes he could be really nice to the wife and then go out and commit these murders, right? So really kind of a dual life. We see this brought up with the Iceman serial killer, Richard Kuczynski. But in reality, this is not what happens. Even in the case of the Iceman, he was awful to his wife, and then he would go out and kill other people, right? So there was a consistency between his home life and what he did in public. Now, he didn't kill his wife, that's true, but again, he did a lot of other horrible things to her. So with psychopathy, it's hard to have it really compartmentalized, right? We don't usually see it expressed in one setting, but then not in another. So if somebody demonstrates psychopathic tendencies in general, like at work or in other social settings, they're often going to express those in front of the wife, and the wife is often going to be a victim of that behavior. So I guess the moral of the story is if your husband is a serial killer, don't expect him to be nice to you, right? I guess that's one of the takeaways. So those are my 10 signs of the husband with psychopathic traits. I know whenever I talk about topics like this, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of psychopathy in marital relationships to be interesting. Thanks for watching.